All right. Hi, everybody. Hope you're having a good week. Hope your first week of class has gone well. Um, Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Most everything should be in syllabus, but if anything in there is not clear, feel free to reach out and I'll try to get back to you within 24 hours. Um, Hope the reading is going well, both in the Hayes book and the Pennington book. You're starting to get a feel for the Gospels and thinking about some of the critical issues that we'll have at the front of our minds this semester together. Um, Last week, we did a brief introduction to the Gospels, and of course, you can only talk about so much in 45 or so minutes. And we worked on the first 15 verses of the Gospel of Mark. This week, we will work on the Synoptic Problem. You might remember that from New Testament intro, but we'll talk about that today. And this week, there will also be a lecture on the rest of chapter 1 of Mark. So we will go ahead and get started. The Synoptic Problem, this is part of our, like I said last week, each week we'll do, along with those exegetical lectures, one just topic that's important in gospel studies. So, historical Jesus, non-canonical gospels, John and the Synoptics, things like that. This week we're talking about the Synoptic Problem, and this is one of those issues where if you're going to study the Gospels in a meaningful way, it's pretty foundational issue. That's not to say it's simple, but it is to say you won't get very far in reading about the Gospels without encountering the Synoptic Problem. And like with any field, New Testament scholars, Gospel scholars, they develop their own sort of jargon to talk about the issues of their field, sort of shop talk or inside baseball talk. So, we'll talk about two source theories and the Q hypothesis, synopses, borrowing, literary dependence, things like that, to talk about the Synoptic Problem. Don't be deterred by all of those terms if that sounds intimidating or daunting or anything. We'll try to break it down as simple as we can today. This is just foundational to studying the Synoptic Gospels because we want to understand not just what the Gospels say or what they're about, but we should know something about where they came from. And that sort of question is, with much or maybe all of the Bible, it's hard to say exactly how we got these texts and how we got them in the form that we have them. But there is, people have done a lot of work to help answer those sorts of questions. And thinking about the Synoptic Problem is one angle on that for the first three Gospels. This conversation will not include much of John, although by extension, we probably could talk about John here, and you'll see why in just a few minutes. So to introduce, what is the Synoptic Problem? What sort of problem do we have here? The Synoptic Problem is a phenomenon that Gospels scholars talk about. And when they talk about the Synoptic Problem, they are talking about the problem of the relationship between the first three Gospels. So many have observed, it's very easy to observe, Matthew, Mark, and Luke in particular, John to a lesser extent, they share a lot of the material between those three Gospels. A lot of the stories in there are shared. Of course, each of them have unique material, material that you only find in that Gospel. For example, only Luke has the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son. But there is a whole bunch of writing that is almost word for word the same between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they also follow a very similar chronology. John's chronology is a little different than the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic, this is a little compound word made up of two Greek words. So that syn bit, S-Y-N, in the Greek preposition soon, which means with or together. And then optic, think, optic eyes seen. The Synoptic Gospels can be seen together, as it were. You can look at them together and compare them. they can be seen to be doing something similar, telling the same story. And again, on one sense, that's true of John. On another level, I think I've said last week, if you spend a lot of time in the first three Gospels and then you go read John, it feels very different stylistically. The material he has in there. I mean, it's wonderful and complementary, but on just a feeling level, you can feel the difference between those sorts of stories, theologically, literarily, syntactically, um, thematically, all of these kinds of things. So scholars, for pushing 300 years now, have noticed, they've observed um, that the degree of similarity between Matthew, Mark, and Luke is so high that it can't possibly just be chance. It can't possibly just be that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all happened to write their stories the same way, and not even that God inspired them to write it the same way or something like that. That is a proposition that some people have put out there. And if you remember in New Testament introduction, we talked briefly about there's some oral tradition that's behind the Gospels. These stories have been preserved orally in those cultures. They get written down at some point and eventually funneled into what we know as the Gospels. But it's not likely that the oral tradition is to blame for, as if Matthew, Mark, and Luke each pulled from oral tradition and then happened to write these stories. So similarly. So the synoptic problem is trying to work out what is the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And when I say that, I'm not necessarily saying those people as historical figures. I mean between their gospels, their stories. So I might say, does Mark know Luke? It doesn't mean do the two guys know each other. It means, does Mark, when he writes his story, does he know Luke's story and copy from it? And therefore, that's why they have similarities. So just an important terminological thing there. When I talk about if Mark knows Matthew or Matthew knows Mark, this is about whether or not they're copying from each other's documents when they write their stories. We will get to see a bit of this in a second on our next slide. We'll get to look at an example. A note, plagiarism. I was listening to something from Mark Goodacre, a scholar at Duke the other day, and he was talking about, in the modern world, plagiarism is just about the worst thing you can do. If you get caught plagiarizing on a research paper or something for class, that is like an unforgivable sin on one level. On one level, that's a modern convention. It's not that plagiarism didn't exist in any way at all in the ancient world, but for authors to copy each other, it was just kind of something you were expected to do if you're writing stories. You're expected to copy your sources. Some people weren't on board with that, but it was very common to just copy word for word your sources. So if we were going to say the gospel writers plagiarized each other, that would be a very modern take on these ancient documents. We do get this clue from Luke at the beginning of his gospel. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Luke, especially in his introduction, is very polished, elaborate language. But he says, Luke 1:1, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word have delivered to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. So we get a couple clues here. Luke isn't trying to explain the synoptic problem to us, but we do hear in verse 1, many people, Luke says, have tried to write an orderly account, a narrative of the things that have happened. Luke says it also seemed good to me. These things that have been recorded by eyewitnesses. We get a little peek behind the curtain in the process of how these documents came to be. One, that there is eyewitness testimony in a great book here. If you're interested in this, Richard Bauckham has a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. He looks into ancient Greco-Roman biographies and how they interacted with eyewitness testimony, and then goes back to the Gospels and considers how that should cause us to think about the Gospels and their reliance on eyewitnesses. Also, though, that comment that many have undertaken to write a narrative about the things that have happened, particularly in relation to Jesus. So Luke here is saying, guys, I'm not the first to try to do this in my account of the life of Jesus. Other people have tried it before. Who's he referring to there? Or is he referring to Mark, Matthew, John, a whole bunch of others who we just don't have? They've been lost to history. It's not entirely clear from the comment who he's talking about, but he does say that other people have been writing Jesus stories and even full narratives. So there's a clue there. He's using sources. He's not just sort of free-handedly writing a story that he thinks works well. He thinks his story is probably an improvement on those who have come before him. But he's got eyewitnesses and previous written accounts. So I think that's helpful for us to frame that. The other Gospels don't talk about that kind of process, but that's clearly what's going on. So I want to look at one example where we can see the similarities between the Gospels. This is the stilling of the storm narrative from Mark 4, Matthew 8, and Luke 8. I think you can see me in a video on the bottom of the screen. I'm waving to you right there. If not, just ignore this. I've got here a synopsis of the four Gospels. This is a book that basically places the Gospels side by side. That's what this PDF is taken from. It's really helpful to see how the Gospel writers are using. You can put them side by side and look at them together very closely. So here we've got the stilling of the storm narrative. Famously, Jesus is asleep in the boat, at least in two of these stories. Go ahead and pause the video here, and I'd like you to try to note differences between each of these, between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Just different details. This is helpfully aligned, so you can just look right across and see what they're doing. So take a moment and pause and look for differences. I'll note just a couple. One that I think is interesting, if you look in Matthew 25 and Mark verse 38, Luke 8:24, when the disciples address Jesus, they wake him up. How do they address him? Look in Matthew's account. They say, at least as this translates it, "Save, Lord, we are perishing." Mark's account says, "Teacher, do you not care if we perish?" Luke says, "Master, Master, we are perishing." They use different addresses here. Matthew's gospel uses the word kurios for Lord. Mark uses didaskalos, teacher. And Luke uses a title that only he really uses, unique to him, epistata, something like master. That's a good translation here. So, I mean, they've got very similar stories, but they choose different titles, which is interesting. Also in, let's see, Jesus's response to the disciples. So this is Matthew 8:26. "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" Mark 4, verse 40, why are you afraid? Do you not have faith? And then Luke's account in verse 25, where is your faith? So we have this characteristic Matthew bit of maybe you've heard the saying, oh, ye of little faith. My grandma used to say that to me sometimes. Or maybe it was my mom. But like that's a Matthewism. Like that's Matthew's kind of saying. We don't really get that saying in the Gospels. Um, whereas Jesus in Mark says, do you have no faith? And Luke just asks where your faith is. Mark seems to be the most pessimistic here, as well as elsewhere. But you can see they're all clearly telling the same story. Look at Matthew 8:24. There arose a great storm on the sea. Mark 4:37, and a great storm of wind arose, and waves beat into the boat, so the boat was already filling. There is a high degree of similarity between these texts, but it's different enough that you can see each author has their own hand in the text. So the job of the scholar or person working on the synoptic problem would be to look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke and try to figure out who is copying from who. There does seem to be some copying going on. Who is copying from who, and how can we figure that out? Some things to consider with that. Scholars have often proposed that Mark is the middle term between Matthew and Luke. So by middle term, he's just the common term between Matthew and Luke, meaning Matthew and Luke rarely, almost never, agree with each other over against Mark. So you might have Matthew and Mark say the same thing, or Mark and Luke say the same thing, whereas the other one doesn't. But you almost never get Matthew and Luke say the same thing and Mark says something different. Likewise, Mark is by far shorter than Matthew and Luke. So it's easier to imagine these stories getting longer over time rather than shorter. Mark, stylistically in Greek, is probably, I don't want to use the word worst, but it's the least impressive stylistically. And so it's easier to imagine later writers like Matthew and Luke looking at Mark's narrative and the way that it's written stylistically and embellishing it with more polished grammar and more polished style, than to imagine Mark having access to Matthew, Luke, or both in writing it with worse style. There's also other things like Matthew has the Sermon on the Mount, Luke has the Sermon on the Plain, which has a lot of overlap with the Sermon on the Mount. Sort of Beatitudes, sort of Lord's Prayer. They're different in Luke, but it's recognizable. Mark doesn't have any of that, and it's very hard to imagine early Christians, an early Christian like Mark, having access to that material and just not including it in his story. So there's a good reason for us to think that Mark is probably the earliest of the three Gospels. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Solutions to the synoptic problem. So that bottom point, Mark in priority, that's just a fancy way of saying Mark came first. So I subscribe to this, and most New Testament scholars today do subscribe to Mark in priority. Mark was written first. After that, it's kind of a toss-up. There's sort of two major ways you can go with that. If Mark is first, then Matthew and or Luke knows Mark. So there's dependence on Mark if Mark is first. So the first way this gets worked out is with the Q hypothesis. The Q hypothesis, Q is an abbreviation of the German word Quell, which just means source. It's the source hypothesis. but you'll probably see Q if you read books about the Gospels. Um, so you've got Mark, and then you've got Matthew, and Matthew adds his own material to Mark. Um, and then Luke records a lot from Mark, but also records a bunch of his own stuff. And then you get all this material that Matthew and Luke both have in common, but that is absent from Mark. Um, and so we ask, where did that material come from? Where are these stories that Matthew and Luke both have that are absent from Mark? One hypothesis is the Q hypothesis. So here scholars have posited that at one point there was this hypothetical document, or maybe multiple documents, but maybe just one. And we'll call it Q. That's not the name of it when it existed, but this document existed, and Matthew and Luke both knew Q, and they both pull stories from Q, just like they pulled stories from Mark. And Q is able to explain why Matthew and Luke share material that's not present in Mark, because they're both getting it from Q. That's how they both have it, so similarly. More recently, in the last 10 or 20 years, Q has been waning in popularity among New Testament scholars. Mark Goodacre, again, that scholar from Duke, wrote a book called The Case Against Q. In my opinion and reading of that, it's kind of the knockout punch to the Q hypothesis. You should probably go read the book. But in short, you just don't need Q to explain that. All of those shared bits between Matthew and Luke. He argues it's much more plausible that either that Matthew and Luke, one of them just knows the other. So Mark comes first, and then maybe Matthew comes next, and he knows Mark, and then third comes Luke, and the reason he has material from Matthew that's not in Mark is just because he knows Matthew. Like Luke has access to both Matthew and Mark. You don't need this hypothetical source called Q in order to do that. It's been a couple years since I've read that book. I remember just being overwhelmingly convinced that there's no way Q existed after I read it. I'll need to go back and read it again. I would encourage you to go check it out. He's a brilliant writer, Mark Goodacre. And he's coming out with a book this year. It might already be out about, I think it's called something like John as the Fourth Synoptic Evangelist or something, just about John's knowledge of the Synoptics. He's brilliant with this stuff. I really appreciate his work and have benefited from it. So those are two options, Q and Mark in priority without Q, which I would subscribe to, but I would encourage you to look into it for yourself. Most New Testament introductions we have today will mention Q, and a lot of them will kind of put that forward as the dominant hypothesis. Scholars have reconstructed critical editions of Q with like textual footnotes and stuff based on the shared material between Matthew and Luke. So you can look this up online. You can buy a critical edition of the Gospel of Q, or the Gospel according to Q. There are even commentaries on Q, just like you would have a commentary on Luke or Matthew or Mark. I think that's a little ridiculous. This is a hypothetical document. And it seems that the evidence really doesn't support its existence. So I just think that's hugely problematic. Yeah, so that's Q. Above this, I'll go back. Other solutions to the synoptic problem. The other sort of popular one, this is not very popular today, although there are people who would posit this. It's really a big patristic solution, although patristic authors weren't talking about the synoptic problem. They just sort of gave an account of how we got the Gospels. Figures like Papias or Eusebius, these kinds of scholars. And the idea here is that Matthew is the first gospel. There's often a tradition here that Matthew was written in the Hebrew language. which there's no evidence for. It doesn't read like a book that's been translated from Hebrew to Greek, but that is an early tradition. And they would say, of course, the early church moves from being an entirely Jewish movement within the first few years and decades. It eventually becomes a very Gentile dominant movement. So they would say Matthew is the most Jewish of the four Gospels. Therefore, Matthew must be written first because it reflects the very Jewish nature of the early church. And then you get, progressively less Jewish all the way to John, which sometimes seems hostile towards Jews. I think this language of more Jewish is problematic. I won't get into that too much here, but I'm not often convinced by arguments that Matthew's gospel is somehow more Jewish or more for a Jewish audience than something like Mark or Luke. I think that would be incredibly difficult to measure, and I'm not sure those are claims that are able to be substantiated in any really thorough way. All four of the Gospels draw extensively on Hebrew Jewish scriptures. It's not like the other ones. Matthew gets all these, narrative asides. This happened to fulfill, what happened to the prophet Isaiah or something. That happens over and over again in Matthew, and that's unique to him. But just because that sort of formulation isn't present, it doesn't mean that the gospel authors, the other ones, are not extensively drawing on the Old Testament and expecting their readers to be able to pick up on it in more subtle ways than Matthew. I just think the quest to figure out which gospel is the most Jewish is probably misplaced and doesn't have anywhere near the explanatory power that we might think it does. I'll leave that there. All that to say, early church fathers really thought Matthew was written first. They often thought Mark was written later. So there's an early church tradition about Peter preaching in Rome. And at the end of First Peter, Peter mentions his amanuensis, Mark, this guy named Mark. And the early church tradition says Peter's preaching in Rome. Mark is writing down Peter's preaching about the life of Jesus. And he's not writing a narrative. He's just trying to outline Peter's sermon. And the sermon is wildly popular. Mark reluctantly lets people copy it, and it ends up becoming what we know as the Gospel of Mark. This would explain why Mark is so terse in its literary style. Why grammatically sometimes it feels rushed or simple, like a speech, compared to higher literature like Luke. I don't find that very convincing. It was a strong tradition in the early church, but for reasons we talked about earlier, I do hold to Markan priority. I once wrote a paper for an independent study on the Gospel of Mark in my master's program, and the professor, very well-known professor, I won't say his name, he wrote a book on Matthean priority, saying that Matthew came first, and he wholeheartedly believes this thing about Peter preaching and Mark writing it down, and that's how we got Mark. I didn't know that until after I submitted my semester paper. So I wrote this like a 30-page paper about the narrative structure of Mark, doing some sort of narrative criticism. And then like the day after I turned it in, I was, you can breathe out a little bit in the semester after you turn in a big paper. So I read his book on how the Gospels, where we got them from. And he wrote in the book that Mark is just the writing down of Peter's speech. That is why Mark does not have a narrative structure. And one day earlier, I had turned in a 30-page paper about the logic of the narrative structure of Mark. And I think he's wrong. And I think my paper it wasn't that good, but I do think there's a narrative structure to the Gospel of Mark. And I don't find this theory about Matthean priority and Mark being just the writing down of Peter's preaching to be convincing. People would point to, in Mark, Peter plays a really big role in the gospel out of the disciples. Um, Lots of different things in the gospel sort of happen from Peter's point of view. I mean, think of his betrayal of Jesus. We get this inside peek to Peter. That's pretty rare for a disciple to kind of get their own, unique story time apart from the others, other than like Judas. Um, all that to say, these are sort of the two big camps, and even within the Mark and priority camp, there are these other two, the Q hypothesis and Mark and priority without Q, sort of the big solutions to the synoptic problem. Uh, I think I've made clear I hold to Mark and priority without Q. I don't think Q existed. I think the most likely scenario is that Mark writes first, then Matthew knows Mark, and then third we get Luke, who knows both Mark and Matthew. Um, yes, we get almost no material um, in Mark that doesn't also occur in Matthew and Luke. Mark has almost nothing unique to his own gospel. Another reason why it seems that Mark was probably written first. You figure if he was added last, he would probably have some of his own things that the others didn't have a chance to copy. One of the only things that Mark has that doesn't appear elsewhere is in Gethsemane, in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night of Jesus' arrest. Mark has that little bit in chapter 14 right there, where the chief priest and the scribes, they come with torches and clubs to arrest Jesus. And Mark tells us they grabbed one of Jesus's disciples, a young man, he calls him, Neoniscos. Um, and the young man slips out of his garment and runs away naked, fully nude. Yeah, that bit doesn't appear in Matthew and Luke. And it's easy to imagine Matthew and Luke omitting that story. Maybe easier than to imagine that Mark would include that writing last. Uh, all this to say, wherever you end up on these, I mean, it's good to try to be driven by the data, but it's a lot of speculation wherever you land. Um, 150 years ago, everyone probably believed that Matthew was written first. I'm sure 100 years from now, if people are still talking about this, which they probably will be, if this lecture gets dug up, there will be all kinds of new advancements in the studies of the synoptic problem. And they'll say, look at this idiot from the year 2025. He really thought Mark was written first, and he thought Q didn't exist. He thought, Luke knew Matthew and Mark. All that to say, more interesting scholarship will be done on this, and the conversation is far from over. It might feel like something that happens way out there, and it sort of is. But it does matter. We need to have some sort of idea about where these texts came from. Even if the best we can do is reasoned speculation, I think that's well worth our time. So thank you for dropping in today. This one's a little bit of a shorter lecture on the synoptic problem. I hope you guys have a good week. Make sure you're keeping up with your reading and your quiz this week. Take a look at the little sheet on Canvas about the semester paper. That'll come up. It'll spring up on you. It's due in 6 weeks or so, September 28th, I believe. So feel free to go ahead and look at that and be thinking about it, especially as you get into the reading from Richard Hayes. That will be that'll be helpful for you to start thinking about your analysis of the use of the Old Testament in a gospel narrative. All right, until next time, have a good one.